Hey everyone, Brandon here with GallowayPrecision. Today is the day you have all been waiting for. We are going to be doing a full detailed disassembly and reassembly of the Security-9. Now the reason I've stepped this up a little bit is yesterday Charles and I were watching some videos on YouTube, and there's a lot of bad information already going on about this gun, and I'm going to touch on some of that. Now, anyone who's familiar with the LCP, LC9, Kel-Tec P3AT, Kel-Tec PF9, the Sky, and the Kel-Tec P11 know that these are all very similar pistols. There are some people out there saying, well, they're all the exact same design, so the parts out of the Sky will fit in a Security-9 and blah blah. No. Let me go ahead and put all that to rest right now. While the LCP, the LC9 share design similarities with the P3AT and the PF9, and some parts are even interchangeable, and the P3AT, the PF9, the P11, all those were first. That's true. The way it works in our industry is you can't just directly copy somebody's stuff. There's two ways to go about it. Number one, licensing. You license the design, make it under your own name. Number two, you change 10% of the design. All right. Now, Smith & Wesson is very intimate with this, as they got sued pretty good back in the 90s, late 90s, early, mid to late 90s when they first came out with the Sigma, maybe early 2000s. Glock sued them because internally, with it looked, felt, and shot like a Glock, like a Gen 1 Glock, and internally it was pretty much the exact same thing. Can't do that. You've got to alter it. Now, with the LCP and LC9, Ruger altered the designs internally, which allowed them to make it and not have to worry about Kel-Tec coming after them. One video in particular we saw yesterday swore up and down that the TCP, the LCP, the P3AT, the LCP2, the Security-9, they're all the exact same gun. Their parts will change out. He wishes someone would make a video to show it. Well, ask and you shall receive. None of those guns' parts will fit in the Security-9. Number two, the LCP2 and the Security-9 are completely different design than anything else on the market similar to this. This is a true single action. All right, it has a single action sear, still uses the trigger bar to trip the sear, but it has a sear. The trigger bar is no longer pulling the hammer, only the sear out of the way. All right. This is a Sky chassis. This is a double action only pistol, meaning that you can sit there and pull the trigger when it's put together, and the hammer will continuously move. LC9, LCP, LC380, PF9, P3AT, those are semi-cocked double actions. Here's the difference. Semi-cocked double action acts like a single action pistol in that you pull it, so you get a light primer strike, nothing goes bang, you have to rack it and go again. But it takes two actions to cock the hammer, hence why the other myth we're going to talk about here for a second is the false reset myth on the LCPs and other semi-cocked double action pistols. It's not a false reset. If you don't get both resets out of that pistol, it's not going to shoot, because it is a double action. All right, it takes two actions to cock the hammer, one to release it. That's where some of the confusion comes in. But no, a Sky CPX chassis is not going to fit in a Security-9 and work. It's just not going to. They're dimensionally different, and they're completely different designs. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get into that right now. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, drop our mag. We're going to lock and clear. We are visually and physically empty of ammunition. Go ahead and let it slide forward. Now, like an LCP and an LCP2, you got to pull the slide back just a little bit. All right. Get the takedown out. We're going to take the slide off. We're going to set the frame aside for now. And now you're going to get a sneak peek at the prototype guide rod that we've got. This one is in 20 pounds. And it runs like a dream. We'll be doing a video for these here in the next week or so when we get a couple more rods made so I can do the different spring rates. But this thing runs like a champ. All right, it'll be stainless steel, flat wound, whole 9 yards. What you've come to expect to see from us. The one thing that's odd about the Security-9 and Rugers in general, outside of like the SR, the American, Ruger loves belled barrels. Don't know why. Doesn't really add to anything. It's not like it is a turbocharger for the bullet or anything like that. You'll hear all sorts of crazy things why people do this. Really what belled barrels do is for the lockup. It's how it cycles, but it really wasn't needed on the Security-9. But it gives you the aesthetic that comes with a lot of the other small Ruger pistols. So it looks like it fits in the family, and it does. So we're going to set the barrel off to the side. Now, probably not going to go take out the firing pin just because we don't plan on making parts where you're going to have to. But it does come apart like an LCP2, where you drive from the inside out the roll pin. Reason I'm not going to take this out is that is a hefty firing pin return spring. So I can only imagine it would be not so much fun to get that back in. I will take out, however, the extractor. We're going to go over it. All right. And the extractor for this gun is very interesting in the way they did it. All right. So it's just standard roll pin holding it in. However, when you go to pull the extractor out, all right, they went with a dual spring design. And the extractor isn't playing around on this thing. I mean, it's pretty big for a gun of its size. All right, and you've got your two separate springs. Now, the bigger spring goes in the back, smaller spring goes in the front. So if you ever need to change your extractor for whatever reason, you'll actually be able to see big spring here, and you see the little bitty oil spot, same size as the tiny spring. Now, the reason that they did that is the camming action of the extractor works a whole lot better with that secondary spring in front, so it's not bottoming completely out every time. All right, so I'm going to put that back together. Maybe I'm going to instead knock the roll pin halfway across the bench. Once you get it started, you'll take your 1/8 inch punch, making sure that it's flat, top and bottom, so it's equidistant. You don't want it sticking out one side or the other too much. And that's it on the slide, guys. It's very simplistic, basic slide, which is what makes this great because the weight is pretty hefty. Shooting this thing, it stays very level even without our 20-pound guide rod in it. It's a very level shooter, and a lot of it has to do with this heavy-duty slide that they've made for it. I mean, it is hefty. But it's not hefty to the point where when the gun's put together, you're like, this is terrible. It feels the right amount of weight. All right. So now, we're going to get to the debunking stupid things you hear on YouTube and the internet part of the video. We're going to disassemble the frame, and I'm going to show you that no, Sky, the Sky CPX, a P111, or P111, that's PT111. See, I'm all flustered. People just making things up gets me agitated this early in the morning. And I'm on my third or fourth cup of coffee. Anyhow, we're going to take it apart and show you that no, you cannot just wantonly exchange parts out of non-Ruger brand guns or even Ruger brand guns. Now, first and foremost, yes, this is an LCP2 on steroids, all right? Everything that the LCP2 uses, from the hammer, the sear, and all that, while bigger, because this is a 9, same design, all right? So, while we're working on the trigger for this thing, it will also work in the LCP2, all right? So, everybody should be very happy about that. Now, similar to an LC9, you've got your hammer spring cup. just like on an LCP, LCP2, LC9. So you're going to push that and pop it out. Now if you look down in here, we've got our hammer spring retaining pin. Now I like this. This is probably one of my favorite parts of this design, because if you ever need to work on your hammer or change your hammer spring, unlike the old LCPs that had multiple cutouts, and even the early LC9s did, where you had to figure out which one do I put it in, which hole, which cut. This looks just like a rolling pin. When you set it down in there, put the spring on the center, push it off to the left side, that's it, you're done. It's also much beefier. They were really prone in the original LC9s to the hammer spring pin snapping. So beefier, always better. Alright, so we got that out. Let's go ahead and take our frame pins out. We're going to get our white one for this one because the frame pins are way long. Get our white bench block, because otherwise you will bottom out. So make sure if you're going to use your Galloway bench block, at least have it angled off of your bench, because you'll get to about here, you'll start smacking it really hard, and it's not going to go anywhere. You're going to break your plastic frame pin. Alright, so let's take out the rear one. Now, let's talk about the frame pins real quick. Notice this, the rear one, alright, has this cut right here. That lets you know it goes in the rear. It doesn't actually, there's nothing inside the frame or the chassis, I don't know if you'll be able to see that, that actually hits that. All that is saying, hey, I go in the rear. Because the one in the rear is shorter than the one in the front, alright, because of the way the frame is at the rear. So don't get these two confused, or you're going to be beating up your thumb with your big frame pin if it's in the rear. Alright, so now to pull this out, what I like to do is I like to push the safety up, take my middle finger, push up on the trigger, so that when I can get it to this level, I can grab with my thumb and index finger on my left hand to hold the trigger bar in place. I can scoot across like that, put my thumb over the safety so it doesn't come flying off. We're going to set our chassis down for right now. Move on to the next portion of stupid things you hear on the internet that aren't true. Here's our frame. Here's our Security-9 chassis. Alright. Another claim I've heard recently, well, the Sky is just the exact same thing. Again, incorrect. Sure, Sky frame, or correction, chassis will fit down in there, but for one thing, the chassis for a Sky is close to, it's a little over 1/8 of an inch. Too small. Alright, doesn't line up correctly. Isn't going to sit down in there. Slide lock's too big. Frame pins are in the wrong places, and even if they were in the correct places, let's say we take that out, we'll just take our slide lock out, you try and set that down in there, it's not going to work. Okay, so guys, really take into account the things that you read or watch on the internet. There are a lot of people out there, and I'm not the end all be all. Believe me, I know a lot. I have to. That's my job. But you're never going to hear craziness like, oh, we can change all the... It's not going to work. So, guys, don't run out and try and put stuff in a gun that doesn't go in there. Okay? That's the biggest reason we're doing this, is to quell a lot of the, well, I think it's this, I think it's that. I'm going to show you everything about this gun, put it back together, and that'll be it. Alright, so the Sky obviously is not going to fit. Never mind the fact that the hammer spring isn't even remotely long enough, nothing. Okay, so now that that part's done, here we have the mag relief. Alright, just like on most striker-fired guns, you're going to have, well, correction, most Ruger pistols, because the LC9 has a similar setup to this. You're going to find a spring like this. Alright, now the one unfortunate thing is, I don't know why they didn't think about this, because the mag release is designed the same on both sides, but it is not ambidextrous. It cannot be flipped around. All right. You can see you only have the one cutout in the mag release right there. No other cutout over here, and the spring only goes in one side of the frame. All right. So those of you that are lefties that'll be buying this, you're still going to be dropping mags with your index or middle finger. The frame itself feels good in the hand. I do like how thin it is. I prefer my guns to have a thinner grip so I can get a real good hold on it, but everybody's preference is different. But this feels and points naturally when you have it in your hand. All right, so let's move on to the chassis. Looks like a lot's going on, but honestly, the brilliance behind the LCP2 and the Security-9 and their designs is the actual simplicity of the internal parts. Okay. That being said, you get your parts out of whack, things are immediately not going to work. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our safety off. Okay. Now when we do that, you got a little safety detemp right there. Take that out. There's your detent, and there's your tiny safety spring. All right, so whatever you do, keep these two pieces together and don't lose them, because you won't find them again. And this being such a new pistol, they don't have the parts for sale on shopruger.com yet. All right, next thing we're going to do, the one other point of contention in the design for me, but I work internally in pistols all the time, is the way they did the trigger pivot this go around. They've got the slide lock lever going right over it. So technically, if you wanted to, you could take it off without taking out the slide lock lever, which I highly suggest. Getting this spring back in with the lever is a giant pain in the butt. So we're going to go over how to do that without removing it. Fairly simple, honestly, but still, it would have just been better to have this cam up a little bit more so there's just nothing in the way of the pivot. All right, so now we're going to flip over to the left side, or correction, right side. All right, so here we have our trigger bar, trigger return spring, but this is what I wanted to show you. All right, so here, this piece, and I'm moving around, that's the sear. All right, you can actually see where the trigger bar, when working, when it's in place and under spring tension, you pull the trigger and it cams down. It's hard to do without it under tension. Alright, so once I've got the safety out of the way, it's under pressure. You pull the trigger, it cams down to the sear, pulls the sear out of the way. That's the end of your trigger pull. Alright, see how the hammer is moving freely? So then it fires, comes back, trigger return spring goes back, hammer sets back like that, and it's reset and ready to go again. Alright, so let's go ahead and remove our trigger bar. Now, here comes a little bit of a tricky part. There's two ways to go about this. We're going to take the hammer out first, rather than the sear, because the sear is under some steady spring tension, and if you try and take the sear out first before the hammer, parts kind of go flying sometimes. So we're going to take our 1/8 inch, I'm going to push out the hammer pin. So now it's not under tension. We're going to push down on the bottom of the sear until you rotate to the top of the sear is out. The hammer is going to slide right out, and we're just going to gently let our sear go back. All right. Big design change I like about this. No dealing with roll pins anymore. Okay. Someone comes out a kit with a spring kit, whether it's us or another company. Here's the great thing about this. They finally wised up and made a solid steel hammer pin. All right. Not only is it a steel hammer pin, but you have these two grooves that line up perfectly with the hammer spring when it's in place. When it's in place and you pull down on that, when you go to put the hammer back in, locks it all in place. You don't have to worry about this thing sliding out. You don't have to worry about spreading open a roll pin with too big or too small of a punch. Perfect. All right. So now, as you can see, nowhere for the trigger bar to interact, just the actual sear. on the back of the hammer. Okay, so you've got your hammer here, or correction, Sear's not on the back of the hammer, Sear's still in the gun. You have your standard hammer with its Sear catch right there. All right, and that's it. That's your hammer. All right, so that's fairly simple. I'm going to set that off to the side. All right, now this part isn't terrible, but you want to be very cognizant of which way that spring is sprung, because when you go to take out your Sear pin, this has a tendency to want to come apart. So keep your thumb over the spring, push the Sear pin out, and push down with your thumb. That'll keep it from flying out so that you can just grab and pull. All right, so now let's talk about the Sear. All right, you can see right there's the Sear itself, but this is all one big Sear, one big piece. Okay, now the way that they've done this is, here's your Sear spring, sits down in here, sits just like that, and when we go to reinstall, I'll show you how this little leg right here goes right in there. Okay, so there's your Sear and Sear spring. We've got it out. Now let's go ahead and remove the trigger and trigger pivot, and we'll talk about it next. I'm not going to bother removing the extractor. If you ever need to, or ejector, if you ever need to, you can actually take 1/16, drive this roll pin out, and this whole ejector just slides right out. Always make sure, there's a reason that they've cut this the way they have. Make sure that you drive this roll pin from the outside of the chassis in. It's going to stop just inside this lip right before it pops completely out, so that you can remove the ejector and replace it. Okay, but for now we're going to remove the trigger. Now the trigger we're going to design is more than likely going to reuse your safety blade rather than have its own, and I'm going to show you the reason for that. In order to get this trigger out, we have to actually remove the safety blade to be able to get to the trigger pin that holds the trigger return spring and the trigger pivot all together. Okay, so you're going to take your 1/16, and most of these you can just muscle out. All right, you can just push down real hard and it pops out. If you have an issue where it doesn't want to, just tap it on out. All right. Okay, now therein lies the problem. Looks like we're going to be going over how to reinstall this too. Here's the one issue: when you start working on this thing, this is going to probably pop out, but that's okay. As much as I didn't want to take it off, we took it off. We'll put it back on. No big deal. It's just kind of a pain in the butt. All right, so now I should have that out far enough. Nope, not yet. Well, this is a tight fit when you do this. At this point, you should be able to take just a small Allen wrench, push, and that pin's going to come right out. Okay. The reason I don't want to drive through all the way through with the pin punch is you don't want to repeatedly be smacking it, knocking it back and forth, because you're going to wallow out the hole eventually. All right. So there's our little bitty safety blade roll pin. Now, notice I've been holding this with my thumb. It is sprung. All right, so make sure that you keep it under tension. If you are holding it and then just let loose, the spring might get away from you. So you're going to turn your blade this way, 90 degrees, and it's going to slide right out. Okay. Next comes our safety blade spring, trigger safety spring, whatever you want to call it. Very light, needs to be, but when it's sprung, this thing ain't getting out of the way unless you want it to. Alright, so now I'm going to take the 1/16, flip it over, and you can see the trigger pin. It just pushes right out. As soon as it comes out, you see it's nice and small too. Instead of having the rounded top, it's got flat, which is nice. I like that a lot. Makes it much easier to reinstall. Alright, so now we're going to push out our pivot and get a hold of the trigger. Alright, now here's another thing. No Sky, LCP, P3AT, PF9, LC9, none of that's going to fit parts-wise because the trigger pivot and trigger return spring are completely different now. This is much longer for obvious reasons. That is a double stack 9, so they've had to widen the chassis. But the trigger return spring, on top of being much heftier, has a different pigtail on it. So again, don't go mixing and matching parts. Always a bad idea. Alright, so there it is, completely, fully disassembled, the whole bottom part of the gun. Alright, so now we're going to start putting it back together. I'm going to start by reinserting the trigger and the trigger pivot. Alright. I'm going to take our trigger return spring. Now notice too, this is a much shorter pull than anything else Ruger makes right now. I mean, that's it. That's your pull. Pull and reset's very short in this pistol. You're going to put your trigger return spring back in, making sure that the arm is sprung forward. Now the way I like to do this is I've got my little metallic or magnetic screwdriver. I get everything lined up. I just push it straight down in there, get it there, and then sometimes the trigger return spring can be a little wonky. Just maneuver it back and forth. What you're doing, you saw the two cuts that were in the trigger pin. It's locking in on the curve of the pigtail spring. So you really want to make sure that once you have this sprung the way it's supposed to be, if it's not going in, don't force it, don't beat it. Just wiggle the spring a little bit and it'll get out of the way. You'll hear it'll go in and then you'll hear that pop. That means that it's locked in place. All right. So now we're going to take our trigger safety spring. And my sausage fingers, this can be a little hard. Let's take that in. All right, now the blade, the curvature goes to the rear. And when you look down inside the trigger, you'll see why. See this little cutout right here? It's on both sides. All right. That is where those two arms lock into place. And so then you turn it like that. Everything's nice and lined up. Go ahead and from the right side of the trigger to the left, put your trigger pin back in, or trigger safety pin back in, and then push it to where it's equidistant on both sides. It should be countersunk on both sides. Make sure the blade works, it's moving, so that you didn't kink up the spring. Try and pull the trigger back with the blade open, it's not going to move. Depress trigger moves, or depress the safety, trigger moves. Okay, so now let's go ahead and put our sear. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our sear. Here's what's important. You need to make sure that the spring is on this side, okay? But this is the side, when we go to install it, this side is what's going to be facing where the trigger bar interacts, okay? So you need it facing that way so the trigger bar can get in there and interact with it. Now I'm making it look real easy right now, but the thing is, you've got to get that all lined up. So what I like to do first is I'll go to put it in, I'll make sure this leg, that little 90-degree bend right there, is in its little hole on the bottom side of the chassis. And we're going to take and we're going to start the sear pin, okay? Once it gets started, so it's holding the sear in place, we're going to work the sear spring down so that we can get that in. Now you know it's in correctly when you can take the sear, move it all the way out, just like we did earlier, okay? So the sear is in correctly, it's working. Now we're going to put our hammer back together. All right, you got two cutouts. This closer, this one's more open. This goes to the bottom, this goes in the hammer. I'm going to hold it like so, making sure that both hooks face the rear of the hammer, because otherwise if you do it forwards, the gun's not going to work. It's not going to be sprung correctly, and then it'll just sit there and be dead in the water. Take our hammer pin and slide that bad boy right back in there, and that's the other great thing about that little cut. It holds it in place. You don't have to worry too much about it. Alright, so give it a little bit of tension so the spring holds it. We're going to slide the hammer back in just like that. Take our hammer pin, slide it in place. We know our hammer's in the correct place because we're going to cock it back. We got our, and we're going to pull. Alright, so we know it's working. So what we're going to do is, while we're pulling on that spring, move the sear out of the way, hammer's going to go forward. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and flip it over before we get to the trigger bar. I'm going to reinstall our slide lock lever and spring. Now, lever's easy. The spring is going to go on like so. Okay, you're going to squeeze it down in there, and you got to push. I mean, you really got to mash down in there because there's a little tiny lip. It's hard to see, but that the spring sits in, it's got to overcome. The leg goes down to there. The straight piece goes across for the takedown. Alright, so let's flip back over. Go ahead and reinstall our trigger bar. Rotate your trigger return spring back. One last flip before we put it back in the chassis. We're going to take our tiny safety plunger and spring, install them in that hole for the safety. Then we're going to place our safety in place. Now, once you get the safety there, you're going to take your thumb, forefinger, hold the trigger bar and safety in place, and take our frame and drop our chassis back into the frame. Okay, just like that. Put in our rear frame pin. Put in our front frame pin. Our hammer spring retaining pin. Take our shepherd's crook. Spring the hammer. There we go. Get it lined up right where it needs to be. Hammer spring cup in place. Put our slide back on. Takedown pin in. Now, and one more thing before I forget, to get the slide back on, it does need to be cocked. Honestly, though, you can have the trigger pulled, take the slide off. See? You'd really have to force it. So, make sure. Unless you want to sit there and be slamming pieces together, hammer cocked. Slide right on, back in. Now we're going to function test. We know our hammer's cocked already. We're going to put the safety on, pull the trigger, nothing happens. Okay, safety off, trigger, hammer falls, rack the slide, reset, hammer falls. So everything's back together correctly. Everything's working, and that's it. That's the full disassembly and reassembly of the Security-9 pistol. Like I said, guys, really take with a grain of salt some of the things you read and see on the internet. Again, I don't know everything. I'm not the end-all be-all of all guns, but I do this for a living. And it's very dangerous to listen to people out there that tell you can take parts from smaller, more fragile pistols and put them in something else. Just don't. It's always a bad idea. But that's going to wrap it up for this. The 20-pound, I think we'll do 20, 18, and the stock 16-pound rate. I don't know if we're going to do a 14-pound for this one. I don't foresee a lot of people doing low-pressure hand loads to compete with this pistol. I mean, this, at the price and the way this thing shoots, this is a perfect defensive pistol for someone first getting into it. This is a perfect trunk gun, keep in your car. If it does get stolen, you're not out your $1,200 Kimber, you're out a $350 Security-9 that's easy to replace. All right, so I mean, this thing has a lot going for it. It's a great pistol, shoots really well. As soon as we get some more guide rods in and our final mag extension done, we'll be doing some videos out at the house, accuracy and just mag dump, the usual stuff we do. All right, so to recap, don't listen to people that don't know what they're talking about or are desperate to be in the industry on the internet. Great pistol for the money. We've got a lot of upgrades coming for it. We're looking to probably mill this one soon for an optic as well. And that's going to wrap this one up, guys. So be sure to follow us on social media. Here on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe below. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Hold on, let me drink some more of my 5th cup of coffee. All right, be sure to go by the website or the Facebook page and sign up for the newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter, and there are 1 or 2 sales every month that we do. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, you're the first to find out about it before I release it on social media. And that's going to be it, guys. Great pistol for the money. Well, yeah, one last thing. If you got any questions, feel free to email me at tech, that's TECH, Tango Echo Charlie Hotel at GallowayPrecision.com. And those are my thoughts. That's our assembly disassembly video. And this is definitely, Ruger did it right. Ruger really did it right, and I think they've hit a home run with this thing. What I would not be surprised to see in the future is a compact version of this. Still a 9, maybe an inch off the barrel, possibly a little bit off of here, and I don't think they're going to have a hard time making them fast enough to keep up with demand now. They make a compact of this, it's done. That'll be their #1 selling pistol. All right, guys, so that's it. And as always, be safe, be accurate, and God bless.